speaker, Robert Grillo, has been branding, marketing, and design professional for the last 20 years. In his early years, he worked on accounts like McDonald's and Kraft Foods. In 2009, he founded Free From Harm to promote farmed animal rescue, education, and advocacy. As an activist, author, and speaker, Grillo focuses awareness on the animal's experience and point of view. Let's please welcome Robert Grillo.
Good afternoon. My name is Robert Grillo. I'm the founder and director of Free From Harm, which is a nonprofit dedicated to farm animal rescue, education, and advocacy. And this is my second presentation here at the Portland VegFest, and it's on the subject of chickens. I changed the name, by the way.
Sorry.
I made it a lot simpler because I felt like this title, Who Chickens Really Are, is more apt as far as what the essence of the presentation is about. And there's like two sides to my message and the reason why I developed this presentation. The first one is that I feel that we need to break through the damaging and inaccurate stereotypes that are so ubiquitous in popular culture today. And I think when we do that, we find that they're largely fueled by the poultry and egg industry. That's where our understanding of chickens actually comes from. The second part of my goal is to provide an honest, authentic, and realistic portrayal of chickens when they're allowed to actually express themselves for who they truly are, and when they're free to do that and not have any expectations placed on them to do something for us. So now, the prevailing view of chickens in our society is very dismal. I call it blaming the victim. That's how I characterize how we view chickens for the most part. Even with people like Michael Pollan and in the progressive food movement, you have rotten attitudes about chickens. Michael Pollan, in a Smithsonian interview, was quoted as saying, when he tried to raise chickens himself, he said, their brains have been bred right out of them. They're really nasty and stupid. This is the author of The Omnivore's Dilemma, who is supposed to provide us with a more elevated, conscious view of our food choices, right? So, what I'm advocating is that we change our views because, for one thing, they really aren't who we think they are. They're not who we've been told that they are. And that's because we're seeing who they are through the distorted lens of the poultry and egg industries. Another really good reason to change our views is that they are the most devalued, they are the most denigrated, and most exploited land animal on the planet. If we can get people to think differently, have empathy, morally consider chickens, this is going to help all animals in the long run. Let's just take a moment to recognize the incomprehensible level of suffering of chickens today. Of the 65 billion animals that are killed for food every year, 40 billion of them are just 6-week-old baby birds. Another way of looking at this data is this pie chart showing that chickens represent about 61.5% of all food animals, and all other animals, cows, turkeys, pigs, ducks, and all those, 38.5%. So, if we want to start with a clean slate, which is what I recommend, how do we learn about chickens? There's primarily two pathways into learning about who they really are. The first one is through careful, open-minded observation. You can go to sanctuaries, or you can watch tons of video online, or you can have chickens, you can keep chickens yourself, and you can observe them and observe their behavior. Or we can learn, of course, from scientific study, of which there's been a tremendous amount of interesting and revolutionary studies about chickens, because much of this is actually fueled by the poultry industry. They're paying for these studies But what's coming out of it is amazing discoveries about chicken minds and behavior, which are actually could potentially elevate the status of chickens in our society. So let's start with where chickens actually come from. Most people think they come from farms, like this one, but they don't. And some people think that they come from pasture, right? But they don't. In fact, chickens like this that are forced to live on pasture, look what happens. They go for the most protected area they can find, and they huddle together under whatever kind of shelter they can find, because the wide open pasture is a very scary place and a very stressful place for chickens. They're very much aware of the fact that there are aerial predators and terrestrial predators, and they are not about to go out, especially knowing that they have bodies that are completely compromised because of the way they're genetically. These particular chickens are Cornish rock hens, which are genetically manipulated to grow very quickly, and they have all kinds of problems with walking because they're way too big and their musculoskeletal system can't support them. So they're not going to go out and run out and have a wonderful time out in the pasture. So the idea that pasture raised means something to them, it might mean something to us, but it really doesn't mean a lot to them. In fact, the studies that have been done show elevated levels of cortisol, which is a stress hormone, indicating that when they're on pasture, they're stressed, they're feeling unsafe. So then where do they come from? And it might surprise many people to learn that they actually come from the tropical rainforest regions of the world. And contrary to popular belief, the domesticated chicken has much in common with this bird, which is called the red jumblefowl or the wild jumblefowl, which you can still find today in the tropical rainforests. They fly, they perch in trees, they forage on the ground, and they have complex social groups when they're allowed to exist. A lot of them have been hunted to extinction, of course. But we can trace their ancestry. This is kind of a facetious drawing. It's not a serious scientific drawing. But the point is that I'm trying to make here is that we can trace their ancestry back to the dinosaur age, to the Jurassic period. So chickens have been evolving, birds like chickens, other dinosaurs have been evolving all the way through to the present. And then something happened. Chickens became domesticated. When I use the word domestication, I'd like to preface that because it has very positive connotations, doesn't it? It's really nothing more than a euphemism. Domestication simply means capturing free beings that are free agents like us by nature. Wings to fly, feet to run, and capturing them and confining them and exploiting them for our own use. So I use the word domestication with that in that context. And so what we know is that the earliest signs of domestication, of capturing chickens, was 8,000 to 10,000 years ago in southwest China. And that's according to this wonderful book called Chicken by Annie Potts, an English writer. It's a tiny little book, but it's a history of domesticated chickens for anyone who's interested in it. It's really a fascinating read, short read too. And then, about 3,000 years ago or more, in ancient Egypt, large-scale artificial incubators were created. This is kind of a revolution in the domestication and exploitation of chickens, because suddenly we could hatch eggs en masse without the mother hen. We could take the family away from, we could break up the family and have chicks and eggs that were raised in artificial incubators. And at one point, there was a hatchery in ancient Egypt that could put out 42,000 eggs a day. Now, I ask you, by today's standards, obviously, we're producing millions of eggs, right, in these artificial incubators. But if someone asked you, is a is an operation that can put out 42,000 eggs a day, a factory farm, and you didn't know the context, you'd probably say, yeah. My point is, the seed of factory farming existed, it is as old as civilization itself. And that's why I find the word factory farming rather misleading, because it actually suggests that there's an alternative. There is no alternative. The model of animal production is as old as civilization itself, which is what artificial incubators show us. So, as author Annie Potts points out, a lot of people ask, like Michael Pollan said earlier, well, their smartness, their consciousness has been bred out of them. And what Annie Potts shows in her book is this. She says, despite the different circumstances between wild and domestic fowl, their behaviors, when permitted natural expression, remain very similar. So this directly contradicts this misconception that people like Pollan make, that their natural behaviors have been bred right out of them. It's not true. So prior to domestication, you had birds that flourished for thousands of years in their natural habitat. And now, what's the future of our domestication of chickens and our breeding of chickens? It's featherless birds. It's breeding them to be blind. It's breeding them to have no cerebral cortex. Or there's even an experiment in England to make them headless. In other words, to have no brain. Now, why are all these experiments and types of chickens being developed? Because this is the way the industry that breeds them thinks. Instead of trying to find alternatives to causing the suffering, they try to find these kind of solutions, these crazy science fiction solutions, thinking that if we take this out of them, if we take their brains out of them, then we can still breed them. It's still okay to breed them en masse. That's the mentality of meat. That's the mentality of the industry. So this is another interesting milestone in chicken exploitation, and this is the discovery of the chicken genome, which actually was discovered before the human genome was discovered. That's how much we experimented and we're so interested in chickens and exploiting them. We discovered the chicken genome in 2004, and it was first published in Nature, which is an academic journal. Poultry expert Professor and Professor John Webster calls the genetic manipulation of chickens, quote, the single most severe systematic example of man's inhumanity to a sentient being. And that's somebody from within the agriculture industry. So, then, the questions are always about, what about the alternatives? What about free range and organic? Some of you might know a sanctuary called Animal Place in San Francisco. The San Francisco Bay Area, I'm sorry, not actually San Francisco proper. They recently did a rescue, and we published an article about it, and they gave us, the information on it, and basically they came upon someone who had out of control a chicken free-range farm. And this farmer called them and said, we need your help. We have all these sick chickens, and we need your help. So they came out to investigate what was going on. And these are some of the quotes from the report that we got from Animal Place. They write, because this farm is organic, they never use antibiotics. While misuse of antibiotics is rampant in animal agriculture, with 80% of all antibiotics fed to or administered to otherwise healthy animals, antibiotics should be used to treat sick animals. These hens suffered for days, possibly weeks, with a painful respiratory illness that antibiotics would have helped. And in another part of the report, she said, 24 hens have eyes missing from untreated sinus infections. 28 have infections so severe that their sinuses have swollen into their trachea and eyes, as pictured here. And she writes, several hens are severely defeathered, common when molting chickens are not fed a proper diet. Others have damaged beaks from malnutrition. And then she writes something really, I think, very interesting and poignant. Why do we rescue hens from pasture-raised farms? It may surprise the conscientious consumer, but these hens are more ill than those recently rescued from cages. These chickens face a brutal, violent slaughter at 12 to 18 months old, although they could live another 4 to 8 years. And that's why they do these kinds of rescues. So you might wonder how I got involved with chickens. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about my chance encounter. I say accidentally getting involved with chickens because it was an impulsive move to rescue these 3 little chicks from a school chick hatching program in 2009. The red chick that you saw grew into a beautiful adult hen named Doris, who became easily one of the most important animals in my life. She fundamentally changed for me how I view all animals. And she was pretty good for like the first year or year and a half of her life, but then suddenly something really was happening. Her abdomen was getting really swollen. So we took her to the vet. Long story short, the vet said, we did a biopsy and she has all this infected mass of egg material in her body and it's pressing against her vital organs. Her eggs are not moving out, they're not forming properly. The only thing we can do is surgery. So we did surgery and he basically said he removed as much as he could, but this is a very risky surgery because they're removing egg material. Do you know how the cholesterol in eggs becomes really hard? What happens is this egg material gets really hard and it binds to their vital organs. So they can't properly remove this from their vital organs and they don't want to get too close to them or do too much because it could risk death. But she came out of this really great, actually, and she lived another 4 years. And then one day, she just collapsed. And I looked into that and realized that this was an example of what the industry calls sudden death syndrome. It's when birds just collapse from heart failure. It's another product of their breeding. So they face all of these obstacles, even when they appear to be in good health. They're very frail. One day they could just keel over. And that's unfortunately what happened with Doris a couple of years ago. And I was heartbroken. I still am for after 2 years of this. But anyway, I'd like to kind of just bring in some of the science because I want this to be personal stories, but I also want to back it up with science. The science has told us some amazing things about chickens. Like one study that showed that hens respond empathically to their young, their chicks. And we know that they form strong interspecies bonds. If you've been to sanctuaries or heard about people, sanctuaries, it's amazing you'll find chickens with ducks and dogs and cats and people. They just have this amazingly social, a very sophisticated way of socializing with other species, of course, in their own kind. And we know that they express emotions like grief and fear and enthusiasm, anxiety, frustration, friendship, and even boredom. And we know that not only, like all animals, do they avoid pain, suffering, and death like we do, they actually are hedonistic. They are pleasure seekers. And you can often find them dust bathing and sunbathing, glowing in the sun, and foraging. And when they find something that they really enjoy, they announce it to the whole flock. You've never seen such enthusiasm for life, for such a zest of life than you can find in these birds. Now this is Danita, and she was the little black chick from that photo that I showed you. And she too grew up into a beautiful young lady. I wanted to name her Cleopatra because her eyes always made it look to me like she had like eyeliner around her eyes, and she had such beautiful eyes, I wanted to call her Cleopatra. And she was the alpha dominant female of this flock, and she was an incredible protector. I'll never forget one day when a falcon came out of nowhere with no warning, and I was actually right in the yard, right next to her. And this falcon came swooping down with his talons pointing towards her, and she just jumped up at it and swung her wing, you know, her wingspans like this. She swung her wing at it, and she scared the hell out of this falcon, and it just totally flew off. So she really didn't take any shit from anybody. God bless her for that. But you know what? In the end, she proved to be, we thought she was invincible, but she actually proved to be just as frail as Doris did. And she died of something that we're not even exactly sure, but the vet said that when he did exploratory surgery, as a last resort to see if we could save her, because she was so sick in her body, she was filling up with water. She was drinking all this water, and we didn't know why this was happening, but her whole chest was full of water. And he said that her digestive tract was destroyed, and from laying eggs, the oviduct had pushed through to her digestive system, and she couldn't digest food or drink water anymore. And he euthanized her because he said that was the only thing that could be done. So I'd like to just go back to the science for a minute and talk about their social world, because this is an area of the science that is really fascinating. So we all know about the pecking order. We've all heard about chickens' pecking order. And the science tells us, explains this a little differently. They say it's a complex hierarchy with specific status for each individual member. And this, having the different status, maintains group stability and coexistence. These flocks in their natural habitat, and when they're properly together, they're not forced to be all females in one group, or they're not, you know, we put them in these unnatural groupings and we wonder why they don't get along, because it's not natural groupings for them. When they're in their natural habitat, they have a couple of roosters, and they have mostly females, and they have their own social order. We know that from studies that chickens self-assess. In other words, they regard themselves as individuals, and they compare themselves against other individual members in their flock. One study showed that they could recognize up to 100 different people or different faces and different individuals based on their physical features, their face, facial, and also personality traits. But they only studied up to 100. They could, of course, they could do more than that if the study was more than 100. And we know that socially dominant individuals, roosters and some females, they tend to be group leaders from which others learn from. And we know that they coordinate group activities like foraging, nesting, building nests for their young, and protecting the territory that they live in. So, this is the million-dollar question. This is the smallest part of the problem of chickens, but it is the most, by far the most talked about. And there's so much discussion about this, I felt like I had to address it. What about backyard chickens? That's what everybody asks. Well, first of all, I always recommend to adopt and never buy. Chickens come from hatcheries. And the hatcheries that sell to backyard chicken keepers are the same ones that sell to these large industrial farms. I also advise people to never go online to backyard chicken forums to get their advice about how to care and treat chickens, because many of these people are very misguided, or they don't have the chicken's interest at heart, and they tell you to do very dangerous things. Treatments for chickens that I would never recommend. Another thing to consider with backyard chickens is because they come from these hatcheries, they're born in artificial incubators, just like, you know, all chickens. And the sad thing is, the first cruelty that we impose upon these birds is we hatch them in artificial incubators. And the first thing they're doing is looking to imprint on their mothers. They're looking around to see, where's my mom? They're never going to find their mother because we've intentionally bred them into this world as orphans. And the mothers will never know their offspring. So the last thing about backyard chickens, the last important thing, is that they are bred in the same way that the chickens that are sold to large farms are bred. They're bred, the result is that they're very frail, like I said earlier. And they're predisposed to a wide range of diseases, including the sudden death syndrome that I told you about, and premature death. And so when we're on a discussion of backyard chickens, another big question is, well, what's natural egg laying for chickens? Does anyone happen to know what would be natural for chicken egg laying? Yes?
Just a clutch or two a year, maybe less than 20 eggs.
It's so refreshing to hear that answer from somebody in the audience. It's good to know that that means that the word's getting out. So that's exactly right. 10 to 15, a couple of clutches a year, for the purposes of reproduction only. But how many eggs do chickens lay that have been bred specifically for egg laying? When I say bred for egg laying, does everyone understand what that means? It means we find certain genetic traits, or through selective breeding, through breeding processes, we isolate certain traits that will maximize output of eggs. That's what I'm talking about. So does anyone know how many chickens that are bred for egg laying lay today? Perfect. God, this is great. The word's getting out. 250 to 300 eggs per year until their bodies give out from disease. Because believe me, these people that think they have hens that will not get sick is really wishful thinking. Eventually their bodies are going to give out. So, this is what the natural family bond looks like for chickens. This photo was taken by Pete Crosby, who's a photographer and sanctuary guy who lives in New Zealand, really wonderful person. And this is what we've done. We've replaced the natural family unit with artificial incubators. And we've done this since ancient times. It's not anything new, it's just done on a massive scale today. Let's go back to the science for just a minute. I want to talk about chicken communication. This is very interesting. It's not just vocalizations, but it's also olfactory and tactile sense communication, and visual, body language, that convey numerous intentions, messages, and details. We know that unhatched embryos communicate with each other and communicate with their mother. When they are cold, they have certain calls to tell their mother that they're cold. Or the mother knows to turn the egg. A mother hen turns her egg about 30 to 40 times a day, depending on her chicks, responding to her chicks' comfort level. And then when they're hatched, the mother teaches them essential life skills. Like basic ones like finding food and water and foraging, but also very sophisticated skills like how to coexist in a group, social skills. And this is fascinating because, like primates, we've learned that chickens use signals that are functionally referential and representational, which is scientific jargon for they respond to environmental conditions and they respond kind of uniquely to what's going on in their environment. And the last thing here is communication is customized for the audience. So, for example, if a rooster is trying to make a big impression on a hen, he's going to conduct himself in a very different way than if he was just with his bros or something, you know. So, speaking of roosters, This is the third chick from the photo that I showed you earlier. And as I said, they came from a school chick hatching program. So this one turned out to be a male. And we named him Ricardo. In chick hatching programs, they don't sex. Obviously, they don't sex the birds because they're sending fertile eggs to the schools and letting them hatch them there. But under most circumstances, for egg farming and poultry, they're sexing the chicks at the hatcheries. Okay. The problem is, though, with backyard chicken keeping, is that for every hen, there's going to be at least one unwanted rooster. Who wants roosters? They don't lay eggs. So we get calls about roosters all the time that are wandering the city streets of Chicago. Somebody abandoned them. Nobody wants these birds. But people need to connect their demand for eggs and hens that they're buying with the fact that the hatcheries cannot control the ratio of females and males. And inevitably there will be, like I said, at least one male born for each female. So what happens to these male chicks? Almost across the board, and this is with some people, some farms, very rarely breed their own birds. This is almost unheard of today. Most chickens come from hatcheries, where they kill globally 6 billion male chicks a year by sorting them and sending them down a meat grinder or suffocating them to death. So, let's switch back for a minute to the science. I'm trying to break up these science slides because I don't want to bore you with like a lot of dry science all at once. But it's still really important stuff, I think. About 10 years ago, this one researcher discovered that chickens have left 2 lobes, 2 hemispheres to their brain, like we do. So it's structured very much like ours. And they believe this translates into the ability to multitask. Another study showed that their brain wiring that controls complex memory and problem solving is very similar to the human brain. And we know that their vision is highly specialized. They have 2 fields of vision. One for close-up, for panoramic views, and one for close-up. So in other words, a chicken could be looking at an aerial predator, tracking an aerial predator in the sky with one eye, and at the same time having another eye zooming in on something very interesting in the ground, and doing this simultaneously. Of course, we only have one field of vision, so we wouldn't be able to do that. So the mail order chicks, the people that buy chicks from the hatcheries for their backyard, this is what it looks like. They ship them in boxes with holes in them, like widgets, and they're loaded onto the cargo planes, and they're bounced around with luggage and all of these other things that get thrown into the cargo. No food, no water, no protection from the elements or temperature. And there's laws in different states, 72 hours, 4 days, whatever the case is. These chicks are babies, and they need very specific care. If they get too cold, they could die. They're very sensitive. They need warmth. Just the other day, we got an email from someone that said, I ordered chicks from Ideal Poultry Hatchery in Texas, which is a big hatchery that sends millions of chickens out every year to backyard chicken keepers. And she said, they sent me 11 roosters. But we didn't, of course, you don't know the roosters until they get 4 to 6 months old, and then they start crowing, and they start having physical characteristics of roosters. But when they're chicks, you don't know. So she got like 20 chicks in a box like this, and 11 of them were roosters. And she called the hatchery, and do you know what they told her? They said, oh, well, we needed to put them in there to keep the others warm, to keep the girls warm. Well, it's like, well, wait a minute. You don't even know whether your customer, where they live, if they're even, if they can even have roosters, for one thing. And they wouldn't take them back. So what they're doing is, instead of having to, what they're doing is they're just looking for a way to get rid of the male chicks. So they're just passing them off to customers that have no idea what to do with them. because they don't want to raise them or they can't legally raise them in their townships. And another backyard chicken keeper contacted me and was in a panic one day. We get a lot of calls, interesting calls. And this guy actually lives right in my neighborhood, like about 6 blocks away. And he said, I bought fertile eggs from a hatchery and I decided to do my first experiment at hatching them with a little artificial incubator I have in my house. So it's like a little science experiment for him. And I'm thinking already I'm kind of, trying to control my response at this point. But what happened is one of the chicks was born blind and very weak. And it was probably, could be a function of the breeding, it could be something that he did wrong, but regardless, the chick was born blind. And he said the chick couldn't find food or water, and he just thought, for me to care for this chicken all of its life, I just don't think I can handle this responsibility. I said, okay, I'm going to come out there and can I take a look? And he said, sure, come on over. So in the meantime, he had introduced, the blind chick is the one in the front, and he had introduced another chick in the aquarium where he was keeping the blind chick. And this other chick became the guardian of the blind chick right away. Helping, leading the blind chick to the food and water. And when they would walk, I was there, so I got to take lots of pictures. And they were always touching, like their sides were always touching. The blind chick was always kind of following the other one. And then he would lead them back to the little corner where they were always sleeping together. And it was clear that, there was obviously a lot of comfort from this blind chick that she got from having this other chick there. Now here's something really interesting. You see natural empathy like this, natural empathic behavior in just 2, 3, 4-year-old birds, right? But the man the human person who hatched these eggs was actually thinking of euthanizing this chick. And he confessed that to me, and I said, do you really think that being born blind is a death sentence? Can you imagine if this was a dog or another human being? You would never, just because someone is born blind doesn't mean, they're not going to be able to cope with it. So, but this is what happens when you go online to these backyard chicken forums. You'll find people that say, oh yeah, you're never going to be able to care for that chick, so just, humanely gas the chicken to death. So, on the subject of chicks, I want to talk about problem solving. This is another area of the science. And because chicks have been studied for decades, they're incredibly precocious learners. And the researchers that study chicks aren't fascinated with chicks. They're trying to understand how the human brain develops. And they're using chicks as a model because they're so precocious and they follow the same patterns that human toddlers and human babies follow in many ways. And what they discovered was that chicks are born with certain cognitive skills that don't develop in the human brain until toddler age. So that was really fascinating. And again, they have this way of, they don't just act on instinct. A lot of studies show us that they make flexible, creative decisions based on what the challenge is, Different challenges, different environmental circumstances, different reactions. So just briefly, want to kind of go over some of the diseases of breeding. This is a hen that we rescued at 4 weeks old. She was perfectly healthy when we got her. And at 3 years old, she started developing egg yolk peritonitis, which became a chronic problem. And her abdomen was so inflamed and so kept filling up with infected egg material, we didn't know what to do. We did surgery a couple of times, and then after that, I said, I'm not putting her through that again. She's just not strong enough. One way to look at this or explain this to people, a simple way, is just to say that they're prisoners in their own bodies. They can't control the number of eggs that they produce, and even when they're sick or not treated well, they're going to pump out these eggs, much to their demise. This is a photo that our vet sent us, Dr. Peter Sakas, who's been an avian vet for 32 years and somebody we really trust. And he wrote in the email with this photo, this is just a quote from him, "This is something we see so commonly with hens, reproductive tract complications, egg binding, decomposed eggs, egg yolk peritonitis, eggs rupturing through the oviduct, all sorts of problems." And this photo was something that I took just to show you the unshelled egg. The egg that they lay that has no shell. And the reason why this happens is because they don't have enough calcium to create the shell. The shell is mainly calcium. And people say, oh, just, supplement more calcium in their feed, pump up the calcium. Well, it's not enough. It's never going to be enough. And what eventually happens is the calcium starts leaching from their bones and causing osteoporosis and other bone diseases and weakening their whole musculoskeletal system. So it's a no-win situation for them. Last part of this presentation, I'd just like to go over some of our rescues. This is a little more uplifting part. Kind of some good stories and some sad stories here. But the first one I want to introduce you to is Angelica. And she was a victim of debeaking. If you take a close look at her beak, you can see she's almost completely missing her upper beak. Whoever thought that whatever they were doing, they completely did a terrible job. But what happened is that instead of her beak growing back, the industry says, oh, when we cut off their beaks, it grows back. Well, it's not really quite that simple. What happens often is they grow back a deformity. And in Angelica's case, she was a very weak bird because this debeaking had caused a deformity in which not only could she not pick up pieces of food, and we had to feed her mash. We had to feed her a mash of grains and water. But that was even problematic because it was getting into her sinus cavities and it was causing all kinds of respiratory problems. She was with us for the last 4 weeks of her life. And what I can say in a case like this is that at least she had a loving, kind place for the last part of her life. And so this is, this is kind of the face of debeaking. I'd like to talk a little bit about memory and what science tells us about memory, because I think it's kind of related to Angelica. We often hear about, an injury leaving us with not just a physical injury, but a psychological component to the injury that we don't forget. And we've seen this in dogs and cats. We know that our companion animals, when they have injuries, there's a sense that they remember them or it could have scarred them in their personality in some way, right? Well, it's true of chickens. Because we know from scientific studies that they anticipate future events and rewards. They have long-term memory of individuals and events, and they retain what they've learned and apply it to future events. And this is Sandy. Sandy was an older hen that the farmer said he didn't want, and we took her on, and she lived with us for 3 years. She never laid an egg, and that's why he didn't want her. But when we got her, she lived 3 very nice years with us. And this is Sweet Peach. This is the hen that you saw earlier in those horrible pictures. This was when she was healthy. This was just when she was a year old. She was mistaken as a rooster by whoever had her, and she was only 4 weeks old, and I had a sense that she was a female, and sure enough she was. And this is not a chick. She is not a chicken. This is Elba. She is a beautiful king pigeon. King pigeons are artificially bred pigeons that end up as squab, quote-unquote squab, on the menu. And this isn't so common in American cuisine, but in other cultures it's more common. But the industry that breeds these birds, it's pretty incredible. They're also used for ceremonial release, so weddings, people think those are doves, they're oftentimes king pigeons. But the thing is, these birds cannot exist in the wild because they don't have any survival skills. They were born into captivity, and therefore they cannot exist. They have no chance of survival out there. So what they do, this is what these breeders do. They have a breeding facility with all these cages, and they cage them, and they put males and females together. And the males and females create these beautiful nests, and they lay eggs, and then they have their babies. And these are the most devoted parents. The females and the males produce milk for their young. They're the most beautiful, devoted parents. And at 4 weeks old, these breeders steal their babies and send them to slaughter. That's how this industry works. This is Ezra. He is a black rooster who has survived a Santeria ritual. He was found tied to a headstone in a cemetery in the middle of winter. We had 2 back-to-back storms, one on Christmas and then one on New Year's this year. 2 of the worst winter storms we've ever seen. There were snow drifts like you wouldn't believe. And a family went to visit their relatives on Christmas Day and saw this bird tied to a headstone and reported it to the police. The police came out and couldn't find anything. A week later, the same family came to visit their relatives again and found Ezra still tied to the headstone, still alive. The police came out, and after an hour search, finally found him. They gave him over to us. We got him into the hospital. And his legs were so tightly bound that they were dead. They were frostbitten. And the vet did surgery, removed 2 feet and part of a leg, and got the his body, gangrene had almost taken over. So it was just a matter of hours before he actually would have died, the vet thinks. So they got him, pumped up with antibiotics and all this. He survived. He's still alive today. 2 years later, he's with Melissa, his caretaker, who they have the most loving relationship. And the amazing thing is, he doesn't need legs to walk. He runs on stumps. I'm not kidding. And Melissa also has a hen of ours we rescued named Lucinda, who's best friends with her rescued pit bull breed mix dog. And Louise, this is Melissa and Louise, who she watches TV with. And this is Gertie. She's not a chicken, but a guinea fowl. A beautiful bird with an injury to her leg. It must have been very painful. Her leg broke at one point, but that must have been much earlier on. We found a wonderful home, permanent home for her as well. And this is me with Edith. Edith was found in a plastic bag near a live poultry market on the ground. And she was alive. And a young man called me and said, I've had this bird in my apartment for 2 weeks, and I need to find him a permanent place. And I came out and picked her up. And came home, and these birds bond with you immediately. She was just look of gratitude in her eyes. And this is Esperanza, another chicken, just like Edith, who is a Cornish rock breed that are raised for meat. She was found in a forest preserve in winter, and the woman was walking her dog, and her kid was with her, and she said, I saw this chicken being chased around by a cat. And the woman had enough common sense to, rescue her and take her home. Some people don't even know what to do. They're like, what should I do? I'm like, find a way to capture the bird, get it in a safe place, and then, you at least have to do that much. And this is Bethany. She was found in a box at the back door of an animal hospital. Obviously, someone didn't want her and figured that maybe she would get care there. We found her a wonderful home as well. And this is Peter. He was found in an alley last winter, and he was immobile. And because he's a Red Ranger breed, one of the other breeds that are used by the slaughterhouses for meat, it is most likely that he fell off of a truck we have a lot of cases where these birds are so packed into these trucks, in the cages, that the ones that fall out are common. And he must have fallen and injured himself and could not walk. But he was fully conscious. The amazing thing is he was eating out of my hand and he was fully conscious of what was going on. So the next day we took him to the vet, and the vet said, no way. Paralyzed from the head down, and the only thing we can do is euthanize him. So, but I think his story is so important because these are the birds that we never see. These are the casualties of that live poultry market, the ones that fell off the truck. And this is Susanna. She was picked up as a stray by Chicago Animal Control, and I had her just foster her for 3 days before we brought her to this beautiful place where there's ducks and geese and a pond. And she just took to me right away, and she was so cute because she was kind of like, as you can see from this photo, it was almost like she was kind of showing off, showing me how, how good she was in the water. And Ginger and Fred are another pair of Pekin ducks. A beautiful husband and wife. And there are two scenarios. Either they're unwanted Easter pets, because this was close to Easter, or they escaped one of these live poultry slaughterhouse markets. Another rooster named Galliano, who someone called us and let them know that in our neighborhood there was this little rooster kind of, running loose in the apartment building, the backyard of the apartment building. And roosters are incredibly difficult to place because, as I said earlier, there's people don't want roosters or can't have them. And so we kept him for several weeks. And in the time of having him, he just became the most magnificent companion. We just adored him. And we eventually, through patience and really looking, we found a wonderful lifelong home for him. Now he has a bantam female and a nice relationship. And this is John and Grace, yet another Pekin duck couple. Does anyone know, when I say Pekin ducks, the white variety, these are the birds that are raised like chickens for their flesh. So the Chinese, the restaurants where they have ducks hanging up and stuff like that. But do you realize that there are 24.5 million birds just like these that are raised for flesh every year? It's not a small industry. That's just in the US, 24.5 million. Of course, that's tiny compared to chickens, which are 8 or 9 billion. But anyway, they were found in a man-made retention pond, and the woman who rescued them, she's a vet, so luckily she knew that they were domestic birds and not wild ducks, because a lot of people might not know the difference, and they could never survive on their own out there. And this is me again with our latest rescue, Rosa, who's a very beautiful little red hen, what the industry calls a broiler. She was found flat on her side with her eyes closed, and I saw a photo that this young lady sent me of her on the side. She said she was on the side of the road and there was traffic whizzing by, and she picked this bird up, brought her home, and showed me a picture, and I said, oh, I'm so sorry, but she's getting ready to die. Because when chickens collapse on their side like that, it's 99% of the time they're definitely going very quickly, and their breath is labored. But incredibly, the next day I got a call from this girl, or an email, and she said she's back on her feet, and she's eating, and she's kind of, pecking and making some vocalizations, and it just got better from there. And then we got her to take Rosa to the vet, and the vet checked her out, and she was actually in pretty good shape. She has a spinal deformity. The vet did all of this free work, actually, for Rosa. And he did an x-ray showing that she has a spinal deformity, but she seems to be growing out of it, and she's just doing incredibly well now. She doesn't walk. When she follows you, she waits till you get about 10 feet away, and then she just runs towards you. And then she stops, like, right in front of your feet, and she just stares at you. She's like a little, ninja or something like that. She's really a special one. So I'd like to just close with one thought that we consider for chickens, and that is that I believe that they're all Rosas, like all of the chickens that are out there bred for meat. And even though the day is not here yet, I think it's essential that we visualize a day when it is no longer socially acceptable to exploit chickens, or any other animal for that matter, because we can, because we live in an age where we actually can do it now. And if we want this, we need to start planting the seeds now. Thank you very much. Okay, does anyone have anything they'd like to add?
Yeah, I've got two questions. One is, are you aware of any research being done by the industry to limit the male chicks that are being born? I've thought about that a few times. There's so many billions being ground up into meal. It seems like that might be some valuable scientific research for them. And, good for the chickens.
Yes. Was there a second part to that?
No, that's the first question. The other question...
Well, I'll answer that first. He was asking if there's any technology or research about just breeding, hatching females and not males. And actually, Germany just recently passed a law. Germany is the first country in the world to recently pass a law using a technology that hatches only female hens. I don't know that I don't know how successful it's going to be. I don't know too much about it. It's a brand new thing. It certainly wouldn't, obviously, solve the problem of exploiting animals, but certainly would reduce a lot of suffering. And so that's a good point to raise, sure.
Thanks, I hadn't heard of that. I was curious.
Yeah, if you look online, you'll probably find some news articles about it.
Okay. My other question was, you had a picture of it was a king pigeon.
Yes.
Is that right? And you said that they both take care of their young.
Yes.
They both provide milk. Is that what you said?
Yes.
I didn't know that birds did that. So that was just, I just want to make sure that I heard that right. So the chicks nurse.
Yeah, it's a very unusual situation with pigeons, and the fact that they actually produce milk for their young, and the males produce milk for their young. So it's kind of an unusual thing. I actually don't know how many other birds do, but I do know that pigeons, certain breeds of pigeons definitely do. It's very unusual.
Okay.
Actually, it's not milk like a mammal would nurse.
Right.
It's called crop milk, and what happens is the baby bird puts its mouth inside the mother or the father, and then they regurgitate this, and the baby bird eats it from their mouth.
Thank you. I had such a hard time imagining a chick attaching to a nipple and nursing. So, all right, crop milk.
Just something about this. A number of years ago, I found a rooster in a park in the Bronx and in New York. And,
Okay.
I had a one-bedroom apartment, and I had 11 cats. And I didn't know what, I took him home, so I had to keep him in the bathroom, and I felt terrible because they rescued him.
Right.
And I contacted Farm Sanctuary in upstate New York, and they found someone in New Jersey who had chickens and had turkey who needed to be had. So they drove out, they picked him up, and he had a nice place to live, and he had a heater in his coop, and he and the turkey had a good life.
Right.
Short, good. And I felt really good about it, but it was I was going crazy keeping him in the bath.
Yeah.
And trying to
Imagine.
him, and so
Yeah. There's lots of stories like that.
and in the city, I was afraid they would start growing in the morning.
Right.
And the landlady didn't know what happened.
Yeah.
But he didn't crow. I don't know if it had to do with the fact that it was going.
He may have been too young to crow, or sometimes when they're nervous or they're they're not feeling very comfortable, they won't crow. Because crowing is a sign of health, if they're healthy and they're psychologically.
Yeah, it wasn't the best of circumstances.
Maybe that's why.
That.
Yeah.
Do you know of any place, what would be the closest place to call if you find a chicken?
Well, I live in Chicago, so I don't know about out here, but the best thing to do is to contact, shelters and sanctuaries to find out.
Or a White House. I don't miss them other than that. Yeah. Why am I asking when I already know?
Yeah. That's the first place to look, because a lot of these sanctuaries have a lot of animals they would like to adopt out to certain caregivers that like we have a network of caregivers that we're developing, people that we want that want chickens as companions. So many of those sanctuaries do as well. We don't currently have anyone except Rosa right now. We've adopted all of them out. And we don't really have the space. We're a small urban, we're not a sanctuary, like farm sanctuary with beautiful rolling hills and all that. We're just a very, it's an urban Chicago environment with a small lot. So when we foster and then we try to find permanent placement.
Well, if there's no more questions, we'll say thank you.
Thank you.